Welcome everyone once again for the third day of Karachi for Islamabad Literature Festival. Before we start the session officially, we would request you to switch off your cell phones or keep them on silent mode. During the session, we would request you to observe complete silence during the session. This session is for 30 minutes and our esteemed panel of guests will be coming along on the stage, please. The title of the session is Tales from Islamabad, City of Spies from Sorayya Khan. Our esteemed panel of guests include Sorayya Khan, Khalique, and Mr. Bilal Tanweer. Bilal Tanweer is the moderator for this session. He's a writer and a translator and is one of Granta's new voices and a recipient of the Pen Translation Fund Grant for his translation of Muhammad Khalid Akhtar's Chakiwada Mein Visal. He has also translated 2 novels by Ibn Safi, The House of Fear, and his debut novel, The Scatter Here, is Too Great, Random House, won the 2014 Shakti Bhatt First Book Prize. Oh, Mr. Bilal.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. It's my pleasure to have this conversation with Sorayya Khan on her new book, City of Spies. And again, with us is Khalique. I'm going to introduce them both, and then I'm going to pose a couple of questions to Sorayya about the book, and then Haris is going to ask her a couple of questions, and then because it's a very short session, we're going to have a short reading. We'll try to squeeze in a short reading as well, and then we'll open up, because we're all, I think, very keen to get audience to interact with the author and ask questions that they find urgent and important. Can you all hear me? Yeah? No? Okay. Is this better? Yeah, a little bit. Okay. हाँ? ओ खुला है? हाँ. और क्या करना है? बस यही हो सकता है इसके साथ. इससे ज़्यादा मुमकिन नहीं है. Sorayya Khan is an English language Pakistani novelist who has so far published 3 novels: City of Spies, which is this one, 5 Queens Road, and Noor. She is the recipient of a Fulbright Research Award, the Malahat Review Novella Prize, and the Constance Saltonstall Artist Grant that took her to post-tsunami Banda Aceh. She presently lives in New York. And to my extreme left is Khalique, who is a critically acclaimed poet in Urdu and in English, a widely published writer and a regular newspaper columnist. He has authored 8 collections of verse, a book of creative non-fiction, and has been anthologized widely. Recently, he won the UBL Jung Literary Excellence Award in the category of Urdu poetry for his collection of verse Mele Mein. I just want to add that Haris is also a very fine poet in Punjabi, so which he does not obviously mention here. But again, a rare breed of writers who work across languages. So please welcome them. Sorayya, so my first question is that you write that this is a book about war, and a book about war that we don't necessarily talk about. Do you want to speak a little bit to that? How is this a book about war? How does that work in the novel? And why did you choose to, dramatize choose to focus, choose this particular drama to write your book?
That's a lot of questions in one.
Okay.
To the first question, how I imagined this to be about a book regarding war, I think of that time period still as the time of the Cold War, right?
Yeah.
And there were so many different conflicts going on in different parts of the world that were shaped by the Cold War conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of the late 70s still being the remnant of one of those.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a moment where Pakistan's history and the Cold War intersect, I think, in a really immediate way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because in the very end, in 79, the Soviets invade Afghanistan, right?
Yeah.
So that would be my response to the Cold War, to your war question.
Mm-hmm.
And the next question, why particularly this moment, right?
Yeah.
Because it could be any moment.
Yeah.
I guess that I think of that moment in Pakistan's history in terms of Zia's arrival and Bhutto's demise as a critical moment in Pakistan's history. And having lived through that moment as a teenager, not a child, in Islamabad, that moment fascinates me. And because I think of that moment as so much of what Pakistan is now derives from that conflict, right?
Yeah.
So I was interested in exploring that from a child's perspective.
Wonderful.
So,
Wonderful. My other question is again simply writing about a particular place. You've lived all over the world, really. But I think that you choose to, again, situate this novel in Islamabad particularly. I just want to ask you how do you think that writing about a particular place gives you access to parts of yourself that perhaps you would not get if you were just writing about any place? Because I think in my writing classes, one of the things that I do tell people is to write. You can write about what you do not know, but I think that there is something that you gain when you write about places where you have real memories of. To what degree does that resonate with your experience of writing this book and other books?
I think the location is actually pretty crucial
Yeah.
to the way I write,
Yeah.
because a lot of how I write is from what I see and from these images in my head. And so one of the major images in my head for City of Spies is the Margala Hills, right? So the images are connected to story.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
Yeah.
for me, I
Yeah.
find that.
Yeah.
And also I think that being outside of Pakistan now, a way to stay close to Pakistan or stay engaged with Pakistan is a way. I mean, I find that for me, writing about it is a way to make it alive again.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's a
Yeah.
personal.
Yeah.
I mean, makes it personally meaningful to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So.
Do you want to run us through the two very interesting epigraphs at the beginning of your novel?
So the first one actually I only found after I had completed the novel. So I wish that I had found it earlier. But I found the first one after I read Basti in English translation. And I found this one paragraph, and this is only one sentence. I go ahead and read it. It's translated as such. They had left their cities, but they carried their cities with them as a trust on their shoulders. And I thought after I finished my book that that's exactly what I feel, that I've been carrying Islamabad in some way in my head or, on my shoulders. And I just thought it so resonated with what I was trying to do. So I added it after the fact.
That's okay.
I know. But so it wasn't a guiding
Yeah.
kind of principle. But the second one, to distinguish it from the second one, which is an Agha Shahid Ali line from his famous poem called Farewell, that I have read hundreds of times and wish I had memorized. Every line is its own story almost, every stanza is definitely a novel. And it's about many things, including Kashmir, but the idea is how does one move beyond that kind of traumatic experience. And one of the things that he talks about in that poem is memory. And the line that I use from his poem in this novel is, your memory gets in the way of my memory. Of course, he situates that in a whole stanza where he says, your memory gets in the way of my history, your history gets in the way of my memory. So it's this,
That's right,
it
yeah.
comes over and over again. And I think of my work in some way as a conversation with memory. And that poem I found, I came across before I wrote Noor.
Yeah.
And so it's been with me, and somehow I find it appropriate to what I write. So I used a line from it in Noor as the epigraph, and
Yeah.
a different line in
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
So that's the.
Wonderful.
That's the
Haris.
Well, thank you, Bilal, and thank you, Sorayya. I think I really feel at home when I read this book because it begins with Intizar Hussain and Agha Shahid Ali's epigraphs, and then it is about Islamabad, where we live, and which of course is a city of spies. and how appropriate. But I'm really very pleased, and it's a personal thing, when I see literary writing coming together with politics without compromising the aesthetics of it. And that you find in this book. And it reads like a journal, it reads like memoirs, and something that is happening in the mind of a young girl who's witnessed 1977. Actually, she happens to be in Lahore when coup happens.
Yeah.
But the Alia, the girl, is actually visiting her grandparents in Lahore, and then but they are based in Islamabad. The home base is in Islamabad. And I think we are, like our previous generation was conditioned by partition to a large extent, or many of them, or our writers, and I say our previous generation, I mean the previous generation of writers. We are conditioned by the years of Ziaul Haq's martial rule. And you find that in this book, and how and I still really feel bothered when I get up in the morning and see the Faisal Mosque. I like the minarets and I like the setting and all, or I pass by the Faisal Mosque, it still bothers me. And I think we are the same age, or the same generation actually, or perhaps the same year of birth. And I can fully relate to what has happened since, what happened then, and what has happened since, and we all are experiencing that, and that is something that really inspired me. And I look forward to finishing the book. I must confess, I haven't finished it because I just got myself this book last week. So congratulations, and thank you very much for giving us something really worthwhile, because Islamabad also, I mean Karachi, there are many books. Bilal is sitting here, and Lahore and Karachi, a lot has been written about, or being written about the cities. Urdu, of course, has a tradition of writing on these cities, but English has picked up. Our English writing and English writers have picked up. But for Islamabad, I mean, a novel coming out and speaking about Islamabad and discussing life here when Alia or Sorayya were growing up here is actually quite interesting and fascinating. I mean, it is a fascinating read and very accessible. I'm growing old, and I find it really. I mean, I can't. I was always lethargic, but I'm now. I just cannot read something which is not accessible. And
you're
this
also
is
a poet. I think that's also a thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You can't read anything that's like more than like few lines.
Well, that is absolutely. I mean, who knows better than Bilal? That's why he made me speak on his book, because he knew that I would just skim through it and say good words about it. But that's not true.
That was because of your celebrity status, Haris.
But on a serious note, and I've confessed that I've not finished it because I had to speak on another book also. I mean, this happens in these.
You had to speak on 3 books.
Two.
Okay.
But you see, there is. I would want to. I mean, the book starts with this very interesting foreword and by Sorayya, and also in.
It's by Alia.
It's by Alia.
Foreword.
Yes,
Yeah,
it's by. Well,
not,
yes,
yeah.
it's by Alia. But she says, and you say that it's half and half. I mean, what do you mean? Is that only biologically you are half and half, or in the thought process and creative writing? Well,
You're very conveniently conflating the narrator and Sorayya.
But it reads like a memoir. I mean, that's the success.
I yell at my students for doing that all the time.
But
I'm not going to yell at you, obviously.
No, you see, because I'm fortunate not to attend any writing classes. So this is yes. I mean, is it also intellectually, and the creative process is also kind of you're half and half, as it were. I mean, you know what I mean. I mean, it's.
Okay, I'll help you out, guys.
Yeah.
So the term that Alia uses, her father is Pakistani, her mother is Dutch, and she's a child at this time. Obviously, the book starts when she's about 11, and the method that she has, the language that she has to describe herself to herself, is that she comes from 2 worlds. So the way that she talks about herself is this term that she comes up with, half and half. And in her mind, I think it is both a combination of parents coming from two different worlds, and also being partly from two worlds at the same time. And I think that as the book progresses, and as she's still a child at the end of the book, but maybe when she comes towards the end of the book, she's more liable to think of that term as something whole, right? So she's moving from an identity that is two different parts to her own identity. And so I think that actually her own definition changes as she figures out her loyalties and is put to tests in various ways. So, little elastic term. Yeah.
So you want to read out a bit from the book?
Oh, sure. I'm going to read this one passage, and I don't think that you need any context except for the date. And each chapter in the book begins with a date, and this date is April 4th, 1979. The morning shouldn't have been so quiet. I'd missed the unwelcome sounds from the servant quarters, including Sadiq's urine streaming into the toilet and the clinking of cheap tea kettle on his single-burner stove. Closer to my bedroom, I'd been oblivious to the drone of my parents' radio and the aroma of my mother's first cup of coffee. I drew open my curtains, and my quiet world went perfectly still, as if frozen in a camera frame. My father and Sadiq were at the end of the driveway. My father was in his pajamas that had long since lost their color, but he refused to throw them away. As always, Sadiq was dressed in an ironed white shalwar and kurta, his head wrapped in a pagri. They wore identical sandals with wide leather straps crisscrossing from toe to ankle. The men opened their arms at the same time and fell into an embrace. They locked together, their shoulders shaking in almost heaves, but neither emitted a sound. It took me several moments to understand what I was seeing. I'd never seen my father cry and never pictured it, yet there he was, weeping in the arms of our servant. After a while, Sadiq pulled himself out of the embrace and wiped his face. He and my father slowly returned to the house, and I closed the curtains, wishing to erase what I had seen. Some minutes later, I found Sadiq alone in the kitchen, his glazed eyes rimmed with red. "Kya hua hai?" I asked him. Although the radio was off, he pointed to it. "Kya?" I asked, just as my father entered the room. "The Prime Minister was hanged this morning," my father answered. His words took a long time to get to me because they weren't meant to go together. "He's dead?" "Murdered," he replied. Noose and all, it had finally happened. My father peered at the radio, his brow wrinkled with concern. Sadiq's head was wrapped in a pagri. The glass pitcher was full of freshly squeezed orange juice, and from another part of the house, my mother was calling for my father. The Prime Minister was dead, yet nothing had changed. "Where is he now?" I asked my father. "Buried." "Where?" "Larkana." A few years earlier, Amir had gone to Larkana, the Prime Minister's ancestral village, on a school trip because Shah had invited the American School of Islamabad's graduating class to the Prime Minister's estate. Now his village had also become his burial site. "Was Shah there?" I asked. Despite the solemn circumstances, I recalled that long ago the Prime Minister's son had jokingly promised to marry me. My father tapped the radio speaker. The children were not allowed to attend, and neither was Begum Bhutto. "The radio said so?" I took a step or two closer to my father, who was bent over the counter, turning the radio, and leaned against him. For a moment his fingers stopped playing with the dial. I couldn't imagine waking up to the news that my father was dead. Would it make a difference to know he died in his sleep rather than having been hanged in a jail? Would it matter to me not to be present when his body was lowered into a grave? The sunflower garden on my mother's new plastic tablecloth blurred as I tried not to cry. "Allah ki marzi," Sadiq whispered out of nowhere. When my father returned the phrase, the call and response sounded like a secret conversation. More than a year had passed since Hanif's death, and for all I knew, his body had decomposed. But I pictured him intact, lying next to the dead Prime Minister of Dr. Moody's descriptions, with a broken neck that must have flopped this way and that when the hangman removed the noose. In reality, of course, the two bodies were nowhere near each other. The Prime Minister's was in Larkana and Hanif's was in Lahore, but death was the same everywhere.
Wonderful. We have about 7 minutes for questions. So, you want to ask a question? No.
Questions including answers.
And answers, yes. Any side, man. I'm not partial to any particular sides. Go for it.
I'll just ask. Very moving account, reading from the book. I'm just curious. Do the events in the book? I'm obviously asking because I haven't read it yet. But do the events in the book progress in a linear fashion, or do you keep going back and forth? And also, with regards to the writing style, are these the memoirs of the little girl herself, written as a child or as an adult later on in life?
Okay, so firstly, the events unfold mostly chronologically. So the story takes place in 30 months from the coup in 77 to December of 1979. 30 months in a young girl's life in which she's trying to make sense of her world. And the second part of the question was it? Oh, no, that was the first part about the linear. Oh, right. So the story itself, the novel itself, is written as if memoir, right? And it is memoir reconstructed from Alia when she's much older, right? But Alia is much older and she's a journalist, and there's one piece of the story of those 30 months that she doesn't know. And so she sits down to write this story and to tell her story of what it was like as a young girl. So the very beginning of the story and the very end of the story is written from adult Alia's perspective, but the whole story where the events unfold is Alia as an 11 through 13-year-old little girl.
Okay. Yeah, I usually like some sort of gender balance, but okay. Okay,
Rita's
Rita.
raising her hand.
Yeah.
As a Pakistani living in the U.S., I'm an American living in Pakistan for a long time, so I just am tempted to ask this. Do you ever consider writing about living in the U.S.? I mean, you would bring a different perspective and observations to it. Are you tempted?
You know, I have not been tempted. I feel like my subject matter is very much in Pakistan, which must also be a way of me trying to stay connected to Pakistan being so far away. But I read this wonderful quote recently by another writer who is from Bosnia and he lives in America, and he talks about how, his subject matter, history in a sense, you can be a diasporic person and you can move from country to country, right? But the history of that original country follows you like a shadow, you know? And so I feel very much like my subject matter is connected to the history of Pakistan, and that's what I want to do. Even though I think it would be more marketable and, probably, I would have more opportunity if I decided to write some sort of immigrant story maybe set in the US, but that's not where my heart is, so.
Okay, I've just been told we have 2 minutes left, so maybe we can take 2 questions and then Sorayya can, answer them together. Please.
If you could just please share a few thoughts and words about the title of the book, why you chose that title, and what do you think of the Islamabad of today as compared to the Islamabad that you grew up in?
So the title of the book, City of Spies, was a title that I struggled over for many years as I was writing this book. The book was actually called The Yellow School Bus in the Land of the Pure. And then my agent was didn't like that title. He said it marks it as a young adult novel, and it's not a young adult novel. You have to think of something more accessible. And so for years I thought about this until one day I sat down and I was revising, but in what the process of revision required reading it from beginning to end. And as I was reading it, I realized that there were so many moments of various kinds of spying going on in the book. The servant Sadiq is spying on an American woman, and the young girl Alia is spying on her parents. She's reading papers that she shouldn't read. So spying as a motif came through for me, and of course we all know that a lot of spies live in Islamabad, so it just seemed to fit on many levels. So that's one thing, and the second part was, sorry.
What do you think Islamabad?
Oh, so Islamabad today I think is just fascinating in comparison to the Islamabad that I grew up in. And in Islamabad I grew up in, you know, F7, the avenue of the F7, the 7th Avenues were like the boundary of Islamabad. And so now I come back with my kids and I try to describe to them what Islamabad was really like, and that Kosar Market was the, you know, the peak of Islamabad. And they look at me like I'm crazy as we sit in a traffic jam. So it's amazing.
Yeah, fascinating is a nice euphemism for. Okay, one very quick question, last quick question, and then we'll be done. Anybody has any questions? You guys are serious. You guys have no questions.
Can I ask?
हाँ आप पूछें बिल्कुल.
I have skimmed through your book a few pages, and it just kind of gave me the notion of this movie that I watched recently, In the Land of Blood and Honey. It was based for a Bosnian girl who went through all the hardships when she was growing up through the Bosnian war that happened, and I mean it's a pretty famous movie. It was directed by Angelina Jolie, so it reminded me a lot of some of the pages I read through. It reminded me the notions of the girl that went through the hardships, and then how she actually was spying through and fighting her hardships, and then coming out of age. So was there any kind of influence like that when you were writing the book, of any inspiration that you had when you had this book written down?
You know, there was one moment that I can just speak very quickly and share with you about. Where I went to graduate school for international relations, and one day I was sitting in the library doing a research paper that I wasn't very much interested in, and I suddenly had this idea that let me go to the card catalog and find out what I can see, what I can read about the burning of the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad. And I found this one piece that was written by a woman who turned out to be a famous writer, Maria Thomas. That's her pseudonym. And she wrote about the day the American embassy burned. I think her husband was in the vault. And I remember reading that and finding lots of information and lots of really interesting details that I didn't know, but at the same time being a little bit offended by that story, thinking to myself, wait a minute, you know, this was her host country and she knew Pakistanis, and, you know, I didn't feel like it was so gracious, even though we understand it was a moment of trauma. And at that moment, even though I had no idea that I wanted to be a writer, that was still years away, I wondered what that narrative might look like. And the juxtaposition of what I recalled of the Islamabad of 1979 with what she was describing was a gap that I thought was interesting in terms of conversation.
It was a response to that?
Okay.
No, I don't know if it was a response, but it was a moment.
Okay, I think we have run out of time. Thank you so much. The book doesn't feature Angelina Jolie, but it is still pretty damn good. Yes. So please read it, buy it, make pamphlets, give it to your friends. Okay, thank you all for coming. Thank you so much, Sorayya and Haris.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.